So for those of us who don't know, can you explain what the National Labor Relations Board is and what it does?
Sure, we're an independent federal government agency. We're part of New Deal legislation, and one of the agencies that was found to be our statute was found to be constitutional, and so here we are, all these many years later. We enforce, the National Labor Relations Act, which gives employees the right to organize or not to organize. That's what we're here for, to give employees the right to organize or not. And so people can come to us and file unfair labor practices or file petitions for an election.
When Bill was becoming head of the NLRB, that was significant to you. And what was the significance, not only to you, but to the NLRB about his coming there?
Well, I mean, it was significant for me personally, of course,
Yeah.
because it was the start of my career. But I think that it was big for everyone because, he was an academic coming in, and I think that was, somewhat unusual. He was also the first Black chairman, I believe. And he came in with a lot of new ideas. He was very behind using Section 10J of the National Labor Relations Act to get injunctions. I mean, it'd been in the statute, but it wasn't, much used. And so, he was very instrumental in encouraging people to use that section of the act.
And what is 10J?
It allows us to go into district court and get injunctions.
And that obviously became significant with regard to the baseball strike.
Indeed, it did.
Okay, so in 1994 is that the baseball players went out on strike, and
Yes.
it got a lot of publicity, and there was a lot of attention turned to the NLRB about what role that it may have.
That's right.
So were you following the baseball strike and with any particular interest at that point, with the anticipation that the NLRB bill might become involved in it?
I remember quite well seeing some of the injunction documents, with what do you call it? On the bulletin board with a thumbtack, and remember thinking, oh, this is pretty cool to be working in this place at this time. And I knew that Bill was in heaven, right? Because the only thing closer to his heart than labor law and, his wife and family is baseball.
You were aware then that the possibility of using 10J to impact the baseball strike was a possibility.
Oh, yeah.
And as you said, is that 10J had really not been used very much before.
It is not. And I may have been more aware of it than some because, he talks about it in some of his books, and I had worked on, roughly 3 of his books and articles. So, I probably was a little more familiar than some.
And in thinking about it, do you think this is a perfect place to use 10J? Did you think about it in that context?
I don't know if I thought of it in the context that it was the perfect thing because I hadn't ever really seen it much used. But I did, I remember once I heard that's what they were going to do. I thought, wow. I mean, I just remember thinking, wow, this is really great. It can have a lot of impact when it's used in the correct situation. And it did, right? Look at what it did. Yes.
And so in terms of it's the action being filed, do you remember the action? Did you have anything to do? Did you work on it at all?
I mean, everybody in the agency knew it was going on. And by then, even while that was going on and I wasn't yet employed, I knew I would be. So, NLRB is in my head.
And you remember if you filed then, and you remember that it was in front of Judge, who was a district court judge at the time, Judge Sonia Sotomayor?
Well, of course, at the time, her name didn't mean a single thing to me.
Yeah.
But now and looking back on them, I'm all, wow, how unbelievable is that?
And so in terms of just joining this organization, the NLRB, and seeing it doing something that you knew that your boss was in love with, baseball, and for you're being able to watch it close up, it must have been pretty exciting for you.
Oh, it was very exciting.
And do you remember discussing it with anybody either in or outside, and that people were interested in it?
Yeah, I mean, there were definitely, mostly the men in the office, but there were a handful of them that were pretty interested in it because they were interested in baseball. And then there were the more kind of, I'm going to say, academic types in the office that were, interested because it had 10J was being applied to it. And we just didn't use 10J much. And even now it's not a tool we use often. We think about using it often, but we don't actually use it often.
And for 10J to be used, as my understanding is that the National Labor Relations Board itself had to vote on whether to bring the action and seek the injunction. And you're viewing it as this was going on, is that you understand what a significant role that Bill had in the decision-making about whether to file the action and how to file the action.
Oh, yes, for sure. I understood that. And, just in my head, as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking, my gosh, this man has already died and gone to heaven.
And he hadn't, and I think he came relatively shortly before the injunction was filed. Is that correct?
Yes, that is right.
That was one of the first big things he worked on.
Yes.
And so we filed the action, and Judge Sotomayor granted the injunction. And
exactly.
And did it.
I know that Bill was heavily involved in resolving the strike back in the 90s, when just after you had become manager of the Giants, and your experience there, and in later years. I'm envious. I've learned that Bill has had a press pass for probably the last 55 years, which allows him to wander around fields and clubhouses and so forth, and that he met you on the field way back when maybe you were then a coach with the Giants. Mm-hmm. Do you have any memories of about the time that you met Bill, and how you got to be friendly, and how you saw Bill as a person and as a fan?
Well, when I first saw Bill, he has a very pleasant demeanor about him, and he had a pleasant, face, and he didn't say very much, but what he said, I could tell that he was, of higher education, and then he kept telling me he was a law professor at Stanford, and I was like, well, how you know so much about about baseball, the history of baseball, and in particular, the American League, and even more in particular about the Boston Red Sox. And then at the time, I really didn't know what nationality, Bill was. It really didn't matter, but I was curious. I thought he might have been, Portuguese or Spanish or something, along those lines. And then he told me, hey man, he was African American. He told me about his history and about his family, and being from Boston. And then that really got me curious, of some of the racial things that he probably went through, not probably, but definitely went through. And I was just curious about him as a person. Now he was curious about baseball, and I was curious about him, about how you get in this position, how do you get hired in that position, how long you've been there. And I was always like curious about Stanford, because I never probably had the grace to get in Stanford, but I knew a whole bunch of young people that went to Stanford, especially being from Sacramento area. And so and then at the time I was spending a lot of time at Stanford, because I knew one of my mentors, as well as Al Adams, but one of my main mentors is Bill Walsh. And so I'd go up to Palo Alto all the time and talk to him. And so, we just had a great friendship with Bill. I'd see him on the road sometimes. And then we had even more in common, when we talked about, the strikes, which I've been on both sides, which is a very, very uncomfortable situation to be in, especially as part of management. Then I was really curious about, some of the strike issues that we went through. Also, the strike issues that, because he was appointed by Clinton for the Labor Relations Board, and and he had settled. I was curious about how his involvement in settling the strike.
All of these people who we've spoken to just love Bill, and not just from the substance of the classes they have, although he's been obviously a huge influence in their legal education, and many of them becoming labor lawyers themselves, but emphasizing how kind he is, and how much he would do for them, outside of the pure teaching, and how much he cared about them, and that he cared about them, and they care about him. Bill told me that both you and he are close to the iconic Red Sox broadcaster Joe Castiglione. Joe's been quoted as saying that that Bill saved baseball at the time of the strike. Bill played a major role in getting all of that resolved. Do you have any memories of that, or any comments with respect to that time?
Well, I remember, that I was told that if I continued to be on the side of management, that I wouldn't have a side to be on, and I was like, well, and see, I was a little different because I had been on every strike that there ever was, every work stoppage that there ever was. Because my first year is 1972, and that was the first work stoppage, right, Bill?
Yes, yeah. The pension dispute.
That was my rookie year, and and then I was in 76, I was in 81, I was in all of them, and so had it not been for Hank Aaron and some of the older players taking care of me and taking care of us as young players, because we ran out of money in about 2 or 3 days, and they would loan us money, which it wasn't a loan because they never made us pay it back, and then when I got in that position, I remember Bob Welch and Dave Stewart and some of these guys in 81, we were stranded, Rudy Law, we were stranded in St. Louis with no way to get back home. We had our own plane with the Dodgers. And so, some of the older players, Reggie Smith and myself and Davey Lopes, I mean, we were loaning money for some of these kids. It had come like full circle. And I remember that I just told the guys, to stay together. And that's what and that's the same thing that we were told, back in the day. I probably would have gotten in trouble had it gotten out, but I mean, that's what we were told. Make sure you stay together. And I had talked to Bill, Bill Walsh, because they had some serious problems with some of the stars crossing the picket line, during the football strike when he was the head coach of the 49ers. And, he had told his guys the same thing, that whatever you do, make sure you stay together. Don't worry about me, but you guys stay together. And I remember talking to Bill, about it at the time. And I mean, we didn't know what we were going to do. I mean, it looked like we were not going to go back to work. Like I said, in 81, we were out 50 days. And, we were going to start the season almost. Right, Bill? We were going to start the season on strike, right?
Yes, yeah, that was the time, that strike was the time the owners said that they're gonna operate the season, they're gonna run the season with minor league players.
Yep.
And they figured that, hey, once these major league players see that these kids are out there, they're gonna cross the picket line. The only owner that was sympathetic to the position that the NLRB took in that strike was Angelos of Baltimore, because maybe he was more sympathetic to unions than some of the other owners, but also Ripken. You see, it would have disrupted Ripken's consecutive game streak had the season started with minor league players as they had anticipated doing.
That I didn't even think about that, Bill. I swear it's the first time I ever heard that.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So we were able to intervene and get an injunction just before the season was to begin. I think
It was at midnight, wasn't it? At midnight or something, right?
Well, we went in. We got in on March 31 or April 1. I think the season was going to begin then the next day or so. The judge, as she was then, Sotomayor, gave us the injunction that we had voted to obtain to rescind the owner's changes in free agency and salary arbitration. And once we got that, the players agreed to come back to the field, and the strike was over. And then they negotiated ultimately a new collective bargaining agreement. So the season was delayed a few weeks because everybody
had to get back to training.
Yeah, the guys you weren't even able to have spring training.
But Bill, that was the worst time of my whole baseball career.
Yeah,
I'm talking. That was the worst time ever, and that's where I felt the epitome of being middle management. Because I wasn't a player, but the coaches and managers, pension is held in the players with the players union. Our medical and dental plans are held with the players union, but we're getting paid by upper management.
Yes.
And and that was an ugly situation where the number one draft choices and the kids they thought were gonna be the best, they were put way down the lower 40s so they wouldn't have to be involved in that. And then up in the upper 40, we had the players that were gonna take the big league players job and play, and some of them had to do this in order to pay their bills. And I was trying to be sympathetic and understanding, because a lot of these kids, this is the closest they were going to get to the big leagues ever. And this is the most money they were going to probably make ever. But then on the other hand, it was going to screw the big league players that were holding out, for better conditions or better salary or whatever. Right. So, boy, that was, I'll never forget it. Talking to my coach, Dick Pohl, at the time, he said, John, he called me John. He said, this is the ugliest situation that you could ever imagine. And he goes, and I can't stand it. And I couldn't stand it either. And I asked my dad, I called my dad. I said, Dad, what do I do? And because I was forced to tell the players that were taking the other players' places, they wanted me to talk to them. And so I said, Dad, what do I say? And my dad tells me, he said, that son, you got to talk to him because you're getting paid by management. But he says, you go up there and say a lot of nothing.
So Bill, I take it the key at that time was you getting the injunction, you and the NLRB getting the injunction.
Oh yeah, that was the key.
And were you then involved in the negotiations at all for the CBA, the
No,
collective
no.
bargaining?
No, I wasn't, we weren't, and, we're precluded from getting.
Precluded from
involved.
that, right?
Yeah. But,
But still, the
no,
injunction.
earlier they had tried, the kind of person who could have gotten involved would be a mediator, but they had a mediator and the players lost faith in the mediator. That's really how the matter came to us, because, the owners kept saying, hey, we want to go ahead with mediation. The players said that's just not going to cut it. And so that's when we became involved.
He saved baseball from itself. The parties had, lost the opportunity to have a World Series that year, the year before. They were going into the next season, and it didn't look like they were going to have much of a start of a season at all. And as chairman of the board, he found a way to issue an injunction to get them back to work and to settle that strike. There had been some very famous mediators who had tried before and failed. The parties had thrown themselves back into their respective corners. And here was someone, because of the love of baseball, his respect for the game, and his deep understanding of the law and finding that unique aspect of the law that allowed him to intervene, probably he's the only person in the world who could have come up with that because of that and his tenacity. That was not easy to do. He was not welcomed in that dispute when he first came in, because neither side knew what he was going to do. And neither side was sure they really wanted to settle at that point in time. So it's one of, I'm sure, in his own recollection, highlights of his career, but one that those of us who respect collective bargaining, respect dispute resolution, know when the time is right to do something that is creative and unprecedented, is a real art form, and he found a way to do it in a very critical point in time.
So I went to the back of the book and it says, quote, if Major League Baseball, I really love this, Joe. I don't know if you still feel this way. If Major League Baseball ever awarded a Nobel Peace Prize, it should go to Bill Gould for effectively ending baseball's nuclear war, the strike of 94-95, during his tenure as NLRB chairman. In his new book, the distinguished law professor has chronicled the game's history of labor and racial relations from his unique perspective.
Who is that great quote from, Bill?
That's from my buddy here.
Oh, by Joe?
Yeah, I recall that. A huge deal for me because our company at the time stopped our paychecks. I had a clause in my contract. Most broadcasters got paid, but myself and my partner did not. Our TV guys got paid, but not the radio guys. That was American radio at the time. And so I had two kids in college, and it was pretty critical. At the time, I had double tuition to pay that we get reinstated. So it was certainly very meaningful for me.
Dusty was also very anxious to see this come to an end, but he was able, I think, to get he was really in a quandary because he continued to get licensing fees from the union, and had he allied himself with management, I think the union would have sat down and had a talk with him. But
oh, that's right. So the managers didn't get paid either, nor the coaches.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think his income was licensing from the union.
Well, let me ask you this, Joe. Great quote from the back, from the back of the book. You've been quoted as saying that Bill has saved baseball during that time. How bad was that situation? And it almost seems like the major leagues, this is maybe an exaggeration, was sort of in a death spiral at that point at the beginning of the season. Maybe you can describe what were your feelings about what was going on and what Bill did and what the NLRB did.
Well, I think it was nuclear war in baseball. It's probably the worst period that I've ever known. I remember we were on a family trip, and I had one son and my daughter with us, from Minnesota to Baltimore. We flew to Baltimore in August. I think the strike started on the 11th of August. And August 10th, we left Minnesota after the night game, flew to Baltimore. And that night we got rained out in the third inning at Baltimore, and that was it. We were all stuck, no charter flight home. Well, of course, it was Baltimore, not that hard to get home to Boston. But I remember thinking it would be a few days, and it kept dragging on, and talks were cut off. They had us do a talk show, myself, Jerry Trupiano, my partner, and myself, general talk show on the flagship station for a couple of weeks. And that continued. And I got a notice October 15th that the paychecks would be prorated the rest of the year, which actually through the following February, because we're paid year to year. And certainly very difficult news to swallow from a financial standpoint. But I missed the game so much. I mean, that was the biggest thing. I think we played about 110 games that year before the season ended. And then I recall the announcement by Bud Selig that the World Series was off. Of course, it dragged through the entire winter. They came up with the replacement players situation, and I didn't like that. But I was glad because I could work, at least. We did those games, which were difficult. I mean, everybody was to play with 3 steps slow and no power. I remember we had a first baseman. I recall his name was Don Barbara. And Dan Duquette, who was the general manager, described him trying to run as Fred Flintstone trying to start his car. Legs going.
So as the strike was dragging out and getting nowhere, at some point, the role of the NLRB and Bill's role became evident, and that the way to solve it was through the NLRB. Do you remember when you first became aware of the significance of the NLRB and Bill in terms of ending the strike?
Probably not until it did end. Bill issued the order, and then Judge Sotomayor, by the way, is a great Yankee fan, in the camps. But I remember it was a glorious day when the camps were open, and we didn't know when the season would start. I think it was about 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later. But it was 1 day or 2 days before the scheduled opener with the replacement players.
Yeah, I think so. I think we went into court on March 31, and I think Sotomayor issued her order on April 1. So that was just before the regular season was about to begin. They had opened the camps with all of these guys who would be there, who would be the replacements, as you indicated. And they, I can't recall, I didn't go to any spring training game that year because it was considered to be, I think, too explosive for me to appear at anything like that. And so I just laid low. I was in Arizona in mid-late March and gave a talk there at the law school, University of Arizona Law School. And but I didn't go to any games there. And then I came back, and that's when we had our meeting and we voted on this and decided to petition. We didn't know what judge we would get. That we, by I guess they have a wheel there in the Southern District of New York, and we went into New York because the headquarters of both MLB and the Major League Players Association is in New York City, and petitioned Sotomayor, who was then a district judge. I know the Yankees now have lauded her for issuing this injunction, but I don't think they were at the time.
I don't think many owners were. But I remember we did 15 to 20 spring training games. And I remember we went on the road. I remember going to West Palm Beach for a game against Montreal, which is the other side of the state here from Fort Myers. And went to all the ballparks. There were not many fans. And, trying to get to know the players. We had a new manager that year, Kevin Kennedy, and a new coaching staff. And then I don't recall if we had actually gone home for the scheduled opener or spring training games that ended. But we did go back to the Boston area. I remember because I watched my son playing college ball at Stonehill College, watched him play at the time. And then we came back maybe 10 days later to Fort Myers for a second spring training, which I think was 3 or 4 games, maybe 10 days. And then the season opened with one game against the Minnesota Twins at home. The Red Sox had a great start that year. I think they went into first place in mid-May and stayed there.
So Bill, how did the NLRB and how did you begin to get involved in the strike as it dragged out?
Well, we were, when the strike began in August of 94, we had no involvement in it. I remember, and I wrote this in this Bargaining with Baseball, and also in an earlier book I had written on my NLRB experience, that the White House was very careful not to talk to us about the merits about any case. I remember one time when I began, I was up there and I was talking to an assistant to the president, and I said, I guess you're really unhappy with what we did on XYZ. And he said, oh no, he said, we have strict instructions not to talk to you about any case. But on this baseball thing, I remember being at the White House before we got involved in, and we went through the receiving line, and President Clinton said to me, oh, the NLRB, if you could solve this strike, it would make me president for life. He said, but at that point, it was right around that point, I think he had named William Usry, who had been Secretary of Labor in Ford's administration in the 70s, a well-known mediator. He had named Usry as the mediator, and Usry had, I don't know when the players filed unfair labor practice charges alleging that the owners had refused to bargain in good faith, which is what eventually got me involved and the board involved in this thing. But Usry had control of this most of the early part of 1995, and he didn't want to let go of it either. He wanted the NLRB to stay out of it, and he called me and said that if we intervened, this would hurt his mediation of the dispute. And so I listened to him, but then I talked to Abner Mikva, who was the President Clinton's counsel, the counsel to the president, and I had gotten to know Mikva. Mikva used to be in the House of Representatives. He was on the Court of Appeals, and he I'd gotten to know him when I first came to Washington, and he said, "Let me get back to you." And he said that I said, "Here, the mediator is saying to us, we shouldn't really get involved in this because it'll work at cross purposes with his mediation." So he got back to me and he said, "No," he said, "the mediator has lost the confidence of the players, and so you should know that. We're not telling you anything about what to do, but the players have lost confidence in him, and without the players, he has no role to play." So so after I heard that, I went back to the board and put this on the front burner, and then ultimately, I think around March 26th or so, we took a vote, and it was a 3-2 vote to obtain an injunction in federal district court. We used this particular provision of the National Labor Relations Act, which allowed us to get into federal court on an expedited basis in this case. We used it very frequently in a whole bunch of other labor disputes in the past, more than any other NLRB had ever done prior to this period. And we used this, and that's how we petitioned what turned out to be Sotomayor.
And within the NLRB, was it pretty you were going to get the vote, that 3-2 vote, or was it up in the air? And what were the arguments made against made by the dissenters?
Well, the arguments basically by the dissenters, I mean, it was basically a question. It boiled down to a question of two basic issues. One was, you see, this is inside baseball, but under labor law, both sides have a duty to bargain to the point of impasse, deadlock. And the employer cannot make any unilateral changes in working conditions prior to impasse. There were two issues. One was, had they bargained to impasse? And the other was, the owners they recognized that they hadn't bargained to impasse on salary arbitration, but they said salary arbitration is not a mandatory subject. This is why I say this is inside baseball, a mandatory subject to bargaining. In order to have an obligation to bargain to the point of impasse, it must be over a mandatory subject of bargaining, which directly affects wages, hours, and working conditions. And they said salary arbitration, for reasons which are probably too complicated to go into here today, was not a mandatory subject. And we ruled, the majority of us, I can't remember what the dissenters said about the salary arbitration issue, but they didn't believe that, they believed that the owners had bargained to impasse. I mean, and it was clear that there was more bargaining that was going to take place. And it was clear that they had made these unilateral changes. They had changed free agency, they had changed the arbitration system, and those changes that they made is what opened the door for the NLRB to come in and on the grounds that the owners had not bargained in good faith to the point of impasse, because they had made unilateral changes prior to deadlock, prior to impasse. And that's what, and as I recollected, the dissenters were simply saying that everything was deadlocked. I don't recollect what they did with the salary arbitration issue, because salary arbitration obviously affects wages for a good chunk of the baseball players. I could go into this in more detail, but I don't know that you know,
Did you argue the case before Judge Sotomayor?
no, the general counsel's office argued it. I was thinking about flying down to New York. I didn't go down to New York for the oral argument, and general counsel's argued it must have been March 30, 31, just right after we authorized it. And I think the guy who argued it was the regional director of the NLRB in New York City, a guy named Dan Silverman, who was an old timer at the NLRB and whom I had a lot of contact with during the.
You had been a friend for some period of time and had gotten to know Bill. I certainly remember Larry Whiteside is just a great journalist. But when did you put 2 and 2 together that, hey, you know, the NLRB was bringing this injunction, Bill, you know, was chairman of the NLRB, and he was the one really behind all this? Or is this something that you realized afterwards?
I think I realized it after the fact, because it was certainly not public knowledge at the time that this was happening. And I think, Bill, we did some email about, I was asking whether you could do anything, and that was early in the process. And it was not clear that you could or would. But I don't know, it just seemed like the meetings where arbitration was being held, that mediator was there, that nothing was happening, went back and forth, and there was never really any optimism that they were about to settle. And, you know, as I say, they were a day or two away from replacement baseball and regular season play. And fortunately, that never happened. But, you know, the after effects are, I think, what happened in baseball led to so many things, including the steroid era. We got baseball back on the front pages because people were very angry. Attendance was certainly down 95 and 96, I think. And then you started with that home run record chase. And, you know, I remember.
Joe, so I don't understand, what's the connection between the strike and the steroid era?
Well, I think it was a direct result. Baseball was struggling for popularity, to get fans back. And when I think we realized, well, we weren't sure, but baseball sort of turned a blind eye when McGuire and Sosa and others were hitting all these home runs, that they were using steroids. And I think they did that because they wanted to get baseball back on the front burner after it had really paid a severe price for this long strike.
The owner's mantra during this period of time, I later saw, was that, hey, if the NLRB does not intervene, we'll start the season with these minor league players. And once the bargaining unit of players, the major league players, see that, they will come back in a hurry. And this strike will be broken. So they saw, as was explained to me, particularly after we had done the deed, they saw our intervention as wrecking this strategy. So every time I came to Fenway, I assured them I always had to pay for my own seats. We'd like to have you here as our guest. No, great, I'd love that, but I'll pay you for the seats. They didn't take into account what the fans would think about the game being played by these minor league players in the interim. And the only guy who was really sympathetic to us was Angelos of the Baltimore Orioles, because Ripken would lose his record for consecutive games played if the owners had gone ahead and started the season with minor league players.
And he also is a labor attorney, right?
Yes,
Right.
yeah, I think he was probably more sympathetic on labor issues generally, but he was really very concerned about that, and he was the only one who I saw during that time as my friend.
What do you think would have happened if the injunction had not been brought, or if Sotomayor had ruled against the NLRB, and the strike continued with those players? Would it have been ended in your view in basically real disaster for baseball?
I think it would have been a disaster. I don't know if the players would have caved. Donald Fair was not a very compromising sort, and I didn't have a lot of positive vibes from him. And of course, Marvin Miller, I think, speaks for itself. He's certainly put the players' union to the position it was. Association, I hesitate to call it a union because they never honored anyone else's strikes, right, Bill?
That's right, that's right.
And umpires or concession workers or whatever. But I don't know if they would have caved. They may have. I think some players wanted to, but I think it would have been a log drawn up out of. We probably wouldn't have had much of a 1995 season, and I think TV would have objected and maybe voided their contracts too. They're not going to have a World Series with, guys that have been released 5 years ago, or because the only minor league players that were urged to play in replacement play baseball were those that they figured were non-prospects, had no chance to make the big leagues.
Right.
Could you sum up the importance of baseball to America and the importance of Bill in saving the game?
Many more can identify with it because everybody can play the game. You don't have to be a giant. And everyone's played some form of it, whether it's softball or wiffle ball or even hardball. And I think that's a big factor why people think they're experts. And almost everybody that a fan considers himself or herself an expert. And I think that's a big part of what makes baseball, the record books, the stars, and its impact on society. I mean, baseball integrated a year before the armed forces did, 7 years before Brown versus Board of Education, before the schools did. So I think baseball's impact has been tremendous, sometimes underrated or undervalued, but it has been a great part of Americana, certainly in the 20th and even here into the 21st century by almost a quarter of a decade. So I think that's really critical for baseball. What Bill did is very, very important because we don't know what would have happened to the game. Certainly the record book would have been skewered. And that's a big part of things. I mean, the asterisk for Roger Maris, which was next not really ever put into a record book, but the implication of that. And I think that would have certainly caused some major issues, as the steroid era has too, for that matter. But it had tremendous effect on it, and I think stopping that strike, getting back to it at the time, and baseball certainly paid the price for a long time. But you saw so many little effects. It used to be that any ball that was kept on the field to play without going into the stands was not going to be given to a fan, and that changed right away.
Yeah.
With players giving baseballs to fans and being urged to do so. So the little effects were huge, and I think the games thrived. Steroid era bothered, I think, the purists more than the fans. They didn't really seem to stop coming to the ballpark because of steroids. They liked the home runs. But there were so many factors and so many unknowns of what would have happened. I don't think replacement baseball would have lasted very long. I think probably when it got right down to it, TV would have pulled the plug, and that would have been the end of that. But what Bill did in issuing that, I think what was so critical, and the timing was perfect, just before opening day, just before this happened. Knowing what I have learned, I certainly would hope that Bill would get more notoriety for his big role in stopping the strike and getting the game going again. Maybe because you're the chairman of the board, it didn't get out there as much as Judge Sotomayor got out there publicly. But I think that I was introduced Bill as the guy that stopped the strike when I introduced him to players or managers and anyone who experienced the strike. I don't know if younger players understand that. I mean, it's been almost 30 years. And most of them weren't born at the time that was going on. But I think the impact is tremendous. And I'm glad you're doing this to get the truth out there, give credit where it's due.